handle concerns that an employee may have been exposed to the Ebola virus disease, and a checklist for contingency events. This presentation will last about 30 minutes, and a recording of the webinar will be available on the Wagner Law Group website very shortly. You can access previous webinars on the website as well. Let me introduce our speaker, David Gabor, a partner with the Wagner Law Group in the Boston office. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Barbara, and hello, everybody. We have heard a great deal of talk about Ebola virus disease in the media. Media coverage, right or wrong, has created a great deal of hysteria. We know that this is a potentially deadly disease. What we have not heard, however, is what we should do if someone who has been exposed to the disease works in our company. We are going to talk about our legal obligations and best practices. Mind you, we can replace Ebola with AIDS when that surfaced, or with bird flu when that hit, and the result would be the same. The second part of the program is timely because winter is looming. Snow, ice, storms, blackouts are a reality for much of the country. Unfortunately, there is also the risk of fire, flood, crime, and acts of terror. Companies should have checklists with steps to be taken in advance of these potential events in order to avoid further harm. The challenge that we have is that there are events that we can anticipate, though we don't welcome them and we're really not very happy when they happen. What sets organizations apart oftentimes is how well they handle the events. And that may be the difference between success or failure of an organization. And what happened in reading about Ebola and talking with clients and colleagues is how important it is for organizations to prepare in advance so that they are not in a reactionary mode. And basically, this is like insurance. If you've got a good plan in advance, then you can handle this in a seamless manner and at the same time reduce the risk of unwanted litigation or unpleasant employee issues. So we're going to talk about preparation. And what happens when you find out that one of your employees may have been exposed to Ebola is that you've got to make a decision literally on the dime. What are you going to do? You don't oftentimes have time to talk with colleagues, with professionals, and come up with a plan. That is a big part of why it's so important to prepare in advance. And by doing so, your odds of coming up with the right answer and the right approach are much greater than they otherwise would be. Now, one of the keys is not just to have a plan, but let your employees know what the plan is. If an employee knows what will happen in a certain situation in advance, while they may not be happy, they are not surprised and they're far more likely to accept your plan. Your plan needs to be reasonable. It needs to be rational. It needs to be clearly defined. And by doing so, you're less likely to be party to litigation or an audit by a governmental agency. And last but not least, employee engagement is a big goal in a company. The better your plans are, the easier it is to have an engaged workforce. So let's talk about what Ebola virus is. According to the Center for Disease Control, the symptoms are fever, a severe headache, muscle pain, weakness, fatigue. You know, those actually sound like how I feel almost every morning. All kidding aside, there's also diarrhea, vomiting, abdominal, stomach pain, unexplained hemorrhage, bleeding, or bruising. The symptoms typically appear between 2 and 21 days. The average is 8 to 10 days. That's what the CDC says about Ebola. Now, what are the legal obligations we have when faced with something like an Ebola issue with our workplace? First, we've got HIPAA matters. HIPAA talks about the privacy that employees have with respect to medical records. We do need to keep that in the back of our mind as we go forward. And then we've got the anti-discrimination statutes, Title VII, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Family Medical Leave Act. Our policies and our practices have to be compliant with those statutes. A big player and a huge driver with Ebola is OSHA, and what OSHA mandates that employers do in terms of creating a safe workplace. If you didn't think there was enough statutes, we also have state and local laws that can come up with policies, rules, regs, or statutes governing how to deal with somebody with Ebola in the workplace. Now, some employees have contracts, whether it's a collective bargaining agreement with union employees or a contract that an employee has. That contract may spell out certain rights that employees have. One thing you may want to do down the road is, if you believe that the contract is inconsistent with your obligation, for example, in the event of an Ebola issue in your workplace, you may want to revise your contract with employees. Now, there's also a possibility that some people with Ebola issues might be able to go out and workers' compensation. You probably should review that with your legal counsel. And then there are employee benefits. In certain situations, for example, an employee may be eligible for short-term disability, depending upon how long they're out for, whether it's Ebola or some other issue. When addressing Ebola, it's very helpful to understand how this can play out from different perspectives. What are the rights and obligations that the employer has? Understanding the employee's perspective would help a great deal in trying to find a reasonable solution. What about other employees? You've got a workforce of, let's say, 100 people, 1 or 2 people have been exposed. How are the other 98 or 99 people going to react? What would be the response from the EEOC or OSHA to how you handle the situation? What would the judiciary do if a case went to court? So I created a scenario for you. Hysteria is music. I didn't pick the name Hysteria by accident. It employs 125 people in its factory. One employee, Helen Helper, returns home after volunteering in West Africa over Thanksgiving. And while she was in West Africa and she was really proud of what she was doing and trying to help with this horrible disease, she exchanged emails with several of her friends and coworkers from Hysteria's music. Several of her coworkers became concerned that she might have Ebola. So what do? They do what people who are hysterical do. They create a scene. So now Hysteria's music has to compose, pun intended, a response in tune with the law and best practices. What they need to do is direct an examination of its existing policies and benefits and see whether or not these policies or benefits spell out what they need to do. Arrange for a review of potential claims that Helen could assert. And also try to understand what their exposure is under Title VII, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, ADA, HIPAA, OSHA, and FMLA. And talking to a lawyer before reacting would be music to my ears. So let's talk about Helen. Well, we know she marches to the tune of a different drummer because she spent Thanksgiving in West Africa helping out. But she's also scared. And she needs to know that she's got a job. She doesn't want to think about losing her salary or her benefits. And she doesn't want to be treated differently. She wants to know that when she comes back to work, if she comes back to work, she will be treated in the same manner that she was treated in before she was out on any kind of leave. Now, if she does talk to a lawyer, the lawyer most likely would be reviewing all those different statutes to find out whether or not a claim can be asserted on her behalf. Now we've got the coworkers. And we've got a chorus of people who don't want Helen anywhere near them during that 21-day incubation period that is described by the CDC, and there may be people who don't want her to ever come back to work. So Hysteria's music has to consider what its obligation is to the fellow employees of Helen. And that's where they've got to do an analysis under OSHA and the state and local laws. Now, what happens sometimes is that employees have reasonable concerns, and sometimes their concerns are not reasonable. And Hysteria is going to likely be faced with having to decide what to do with the unreasonable concerns as well as the reasonable ones. And one of the major goals when trying to deal with all these other employees is to create harmony in the workplace. So Hysteria has options. The first thing they can do, fire Helen. We don't want her anywhere near us. She went out. It was her risk. She knew what she was doing. She went out. She got exposed. She'll never come back to work here. Now all these other employees with their unreasonable demands and expectations are satisfied. I'm not going to suggest at all that Helen be terminated. However, it is an option available to Hysteria. Tell Helen she could take an unpaid leave. Well, in our company, if you don't work, you don't get paid, period. I also do not advocate this approach. I think this is a mistake to tell her to take an unpaid leave because now she's got economic damages, and now she's got something that can be recoverable in court down the road. Tell Helen she can take a paid leave. This puts her in as good a position as if she had never taken leave. This is the start of what is the best approach. But we can add to it that we can find a way for Helen to work remotely, dependent upon the job that you have. And we have so many different kinds of people who log into the webinars with different sorts of jobs, ranging from people working in a factory to professionals and so on and so forth. There are jobs that can be performed, at least in part, remotely. So maybe the best thing to do is tell Helen that she stays out of work for up to the 21 days, and during that time she's away from the office, she can do some work from home. And that way, at least you're getting something for your money. And it eases the burden on the employer in that off chance that you do have somebody with Ebola who works for you. Now, the other thing you can do, which I don't advocate, is let her come back to work provided she has no symptoms. Well, she may not report her symptoms. She may deny symptoms, make believe she doesn't have them, pretend she doesn't have them, or block them out because the thought of having the symptoms is really terrifying to her. So what I advocate is a paid leave and trying to find ways for Helen to work remotely. So we're going to spin the hypothetical a little bit. Now, what if Helen was born in West Africa? Does that change the analysis any? The answer is yes, because now there's a possibility that she can claim that her national origin played a part in decisions regarding her employment. You'd have to make sure in this case that you don't have exposure to Title VII in how you handle her claim. Now we're going to change the employer. Helen is no longer employed by Hysteria. She now works for Clinic Classes. And she was sent off to West Africa by Rebecca to train at a health center. Does that change anything? The answer is yes, because the illness or the risk of the illness was contracted while she was working. There is a possibility that a claim can be asserted through workers' compensation. And because it can be inserted through workers' compensation, that could ease some of the financial burden to the employer during the 2 or 3 weeks that she's not at work. Let's spin it a little bit more. What if Helen was asked to go to West Africa to train at a hospital, and better still, a hospital that is treating people with Ebola? And she says, no, I am not going. Can she do that? Dependent upon the terms of her employment and the kind of company she's with, the answer is she probably would be within her rights to say, no, I'm not going, out of fear of contracting a potentially fatal illness, and her rights would be created in that situation under OSHA. And 4, what if she was asked to train in a hospital that had an Ebola patient 45 or more days in the past, and she says no? Now her objection becomes unreasonable because there are no Ebola patients at that hospital, and there is really no risk at all that she can contract that horrible illness. Let's take a quick look at the ADA, because the ADA is one of the statutes that does govern, or potentially would govern, how you treat a person with Ebola, and here's why. The Americans with Disabilities Act protects people with serious medical conditions. Now, the risk of Ebola is not a serious medical condition. However, it also protects people who are regarded as disabled. Now, a person who has a risk of Ebola, and you've got the hysteria in your workplace and people don't want to be exposed to it, in that situation, the person could very well be regarded as disabled. And in that event, the ADA does protect that employee from a hostile work environment, disparate treatment, retaliation, and any economic loss. In that situation, what a court would most likely expect is that the employer find that reasonable accommodation, i.e., have them stay home for the 1, 2, or 3 weeks, and also, to the extent possible, you want to try to give them a chance to work from home. Now, the Family Medical Leave Act, many people have asked me in the last 2 weeks whether this applies. And my answer is most likely it does not apply, because the Family Medical Leave Act arises when a person has a serious health condition, and then you can take leave. The risk of having Ebola, because you were exposed to it, is not a serious health condition. Compare that to a person who actually does have Ebola, who then would be entitled to go out on leave. OSHA has made it very clear, and all you've got to do is visit the website to see it. It says employers must furnish employees with a place of employment free from recognized hazards that are causing or are likely to cause death or serious physical harm to employees. Employers must protect their workers from exposure to Ebola virus on the job. Now, that mandate is very clear. A couple of people with schools have asked me what they should do if a student or faculty member is exposed to Ebola. And the answer is every school that I know of has employees. And since there's an obligation to protect employees from exposure to Ebola, that would apply to students and faculty so that the employees at the school are not exposed to Ebola. So I think what happens is they would have to find ways to keep the person out of school for that period of up to 3 weeks, and at that point get clarification from a doctor that they have no symptoms and they can come back to work or to school. One of the things that's so important, and I know I sound like a broken record when I say this, is be careful not to retaliate against anybody who exercises a right under OSHA or any anti-discrimination law. Even if they're wrong, don't retaliate against them. So why have a policy in advance? Because this is your opportunity to clarify your process, your expectations of your workforce, and the protocol that you're going to use. The benefits are you will have better decision making. If you know in advance how to handle a situation, you'll do a better job. Think of it like driving a car. If you see a driveway and you see a car in the driveway, keep a little bit of your eye on that car to see if he's backing out. And if he does back out, be ready to react. That driver may not see you, but you think in advance what you're going to do if that situation arises. The same is true for the employer-employee relationship. Let your employees know what their rights are. If they know what their rights are and you're clear and you're upfront and you're transparent, you're fulfilling your obligations and you're making the government agencies happy. You'll please judges if you ever have to go to court. Importantly, also, get your employees to understand what your responsibilities are. So if you create a policy that says someone is going to have to stay out of work if it's unsafe to have them in the workplace, we're doing this because that's our legal obligation under OSHA, and it's our moral and ethical obligation to our employees. Then when an employee is asked to stay home, they understand why you're doing this, and there's a better chance for them to accept it. Ensure your policy is even-handed, because if you apply it differently for different people, almost everybody falls into one protected category or another. You're leaving yourself exposed to a claim of disparate treatment, which means you're going to be paying a lot of money to a lawyer to defend you. And this creates continuity within your workforce. Continuity in your workforce gives you a much better chance to have superior work product and an engaged and happy workforce. So what would your policy look like? You might want to call it something like a contingency leave policy, and that you have the right to tell an employee to stay away from the workplace based upon your safety concern. Whenever possible, have that employee work remotely. This way the employee is giving you something in exchange for the salary and benefits, and it keeps the employee involved in the work of the company. The employee will receive full compensation and benefits. And it's important to make sure that the employee is able to return to the same position. And if because of an emergency you have to fill that position, a substantially comparable position. Now, during the time the employee is away, also keep the employee involved in communication. If there's a newsletter, if there's an event coming up, if there's a notice, a change in policy, make the employee a part of the process. Finally, explore benefits that you can look at to offset the cost that you have by having an employee on a paid leave. And at the same time, make sure that this does not penalize the employee. Now, this is not just about Ebola. As I said before, way back in the day, there was AIDS, there was bird flu. If you go back, a long way, there was polio. There have been so many times in our history where issues have arisen that have created fear in the workplace, that you could end up with people getting sick, people dying, and as a result, it becomes important to make this not the Ebola policy, but a contingent leave policy that benefits you going forward. And make sure the approach is reasoned. You may need to educate the team before a person comes back. And in so doing, make it clear and appease them and ease them of the fears that there is no risk when the employee returns. Oftentimes, an executive delivering the message is inadequate to appease the workforce. So you may want to bring a professional in, a healthcare worker, a doctor, someone from the CDC who comes in to talk to your team. And draw a fine line in the sand. And on one side is your message, and the other side would be divulging unnecessary medical information about the employee. And one tip is, if you have an EAP, and an employee assistance program, they can come in and they can conduct something that is oftentimes termed a critical incident initiative, and talk with your employees in that department or the entire company on a one-on-one basis and talk with them about the fact that there is no risk for this employee coming back. If you don't have an EAP program, you still can contract with an EAP professional to provide those services. So let's jump over to part 2. And this is really a reminder to make sure that you've got that checklist in place. I mean, I know I sound like doom and gloom when I talk about storms, blackouts, fire, floods, criminal acts, acts of terror. But these things do happen. And it's so critical for the continuity, employee engagement, avoiding legal exposure to make sure you've got your plans in place in advance. What we oftentimes like to do is make sure that people know their role, understand their responsibilities prior to a blackout, prior to closing due to unsafe travel, prior to a flood. Make sure your policies also address things like your obligations under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Do an audit, because sometimes when you've got people who are hourly employees and they end up working, even if it's remotely, even if it's to communicate issues because the office is going to be closed, they have a right to be paid for that time. So issues that can arise: unsafe travel. You can't get in because of 15 inches of snow. If you are going to close the office, for whatever reason, a blackout, a flood, a fire, a blizzard, a hurricane, whatever it is, the timing's important. If the decision is going to be made, make it before your employees go on the road. Because once they start traveling and you tell them, especially the people who are hourly, that the office is closed and they've been on the road for any length of time, they're not going to be very happy with you. Consider your wage obligations. Look at employment contracts. Look at who's exempt, meaning that they don't get paid for overtime. Look who's paid by the hour, and make sure that your policies and practices are up to date. If people can work remotely in unsafe weather, have them work remotely. And if they're an hourly employee, make sure they track their time correctly. What steps are you taking to protect your physical property in the event that there is some kind of a catastrophic event? And this ties into data. If you can scan documents into the computer system so that you've got these documents in your possession, even if there's a flood and the hard copies are damaged, do it. Don't say, I'll do it next year. Do it now. I remember a couple of years ago when they had that horrible hurricane that flooded a good chunk of New Jersey and towns on Long Island. There were so many companies that had damaged documents they could never get back. When the planes hit the World Trade Center in 2001, there were files that were destroyed that never came back. Much of this could have been scanned onto the computer and preserved so that it would not be destroyed. Review your deliverables and make sure that even if there is a storm, there's a closure, a blackout, or what have you, you get your jobs done on time. And the better you prepare your policies, the better the morale within the company. So let's make a checklist that would be very helpful. Make sure that you've got your policies in place that let your team know what the company does if blizzard, bad weather, ice storm, blackout, tornado, or what have you. Let people know in advance. If there is going to be a closed office, we expect you to work from home. No, you don't have to work from home. Let them know in advance. Make sure your payroll practices are compliant when you've got a closed office or when people are working remotely. Make it clear, if we close the office, hourly people are not paid, or hourly people are paid. Don't do it on a case-by-case basis. Have a policy and stick to the policy. Make sure all the employees have the policy. I have several times had cases brought to my attention where A company had a policy. They disseminated the policy. New people came in. They were not given this policy because it was not part of the employee manual. They were never notified of it, and they were rather disappointed to find out the policy existed unbeknownst to them. Review the chain of command. Who makes a decision to close the office? Who makes the decisions on what people are coming in or not coming in, if some people can make it in and others can't? And if that person whose job it is to make that decision is, for whatever reason, unavailable, maybe on vacation, who is next in command? Make sure you've got the process set in advance. Now, you do need to have lists and processes for contacting your employees in the event of a closure or delayed opening. How are you going to reach the employees? Who's going to do it? Who has access to the phone numbers, the email addresses, etc.? And delineate those responsibilities, keeping in mind that you may not have access to the computer. So if you don't have access to the computer, how are you going to reach these people? We have third parties. Let's suppose Jill has a 10 o'clock appointment with Fred, and she's not going to make it in. How is she going to let Fred know that she's not getting into the office? Make sure that this information is available remotely. Third parties also include your computer provider, your internet provider, your phone provider, and your adversaries if you're in the legal system. People you've got to work with remotely that day. Have access to the information available to you even if you cannot make it into the office. And as I said earlier, protect your property. Whatever you can do to scan information in so you've got redundancy, please do it. And that goes to the next point, which is data privacy. You have information in your office people cannot see. Health records, dates of birth, social security numbers, bank records, other financial records. Your company may have tax records for people. Make sure this information remains private, even if there is some sort of a catastrophe like a fire or a flood or things along those lines. And then the last point is insurance coverage. Audit your insurance and make sure it covers every potential foreseeable event. It may be necessary for you to, or appropriate for you to, have your insurance policies audited by another commercial insurance broker. They will do that for you. So thank you very much for joining in the program today. You know, we talked about emerging issues. I know it's not a pleasant topic to talk about, but if you can do things in advance, you reduce your exposure, your risk, and you have a much, much greater chance of success. You know, there is more to technology. There are a lot more regs and rules that you need to work with. That's why these programs are also very important. If you are not already receiving notices of programs that we put on at the Wagner Law Group, please send an email to me and I'll have you added to our list. We do alerts and we do webinars on a regular basis, and we believe strongly in educating our colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, and thank you to everyone for attending this webinar. A recording will be available on the Wagner Law Group website shortly, as well as the PowerPoint slides if you're interested. If you wrote your questions in the chat box, David will contact you, and if you have any questions, please get in touch with him. Thank you very much.